I can still feel the chill of that fateful night in the desert. The night I came face to face with the horrors that lurked in the shadows. I was a young soldier, barely out of training, stationed at a remote military outpost in the heart of the Arizona desert. Our mission was classified, but we were told it involved monitoring and protecting a top-secret government facility deep within the wilderness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, our squad geared up for the night shift. The desert was an unforgiving place, and the night brought its own set of terrors. We had heard rumors from the old-timers, stories whispered around the campfire about strange happenings in these desolate lands. They called them Skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures from Navajo folklore. I had always dismissed such tales as the ramblings of superstitious soldiers, but that night, I would come to believe. The night was moonless, the darkness oppressive as we patrolled the perimeter. I walked alongside my comrade, Private Daniels, our flashlights cutting through the obsidian veil. The only sound was the soft crunch of our boots on the sandy ground and the distant howl of coyotes. It was an eerie backdrop for the events that were about to unfold. As we rounded a bend in the dirt road, I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A shadowy figure darted between the saguaro cacti just beyond the reach of our beams. I whispered to Daniels, "Did you see that?" He nodded, his face etched with unease. "Yeah, I did. Probably just a coyote. But something about it didn't sit right with me. Coyotes didn't move like that. They were cautious creatures, not given to sudden dashes through the desert night." I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, and a sense of foreboding settled in my chest. We continued our patrol, the unease growing with each step. It wasn't long before we heard it, the haunting sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. A mournful, otherworldly howl echoed through the desert, a sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was a sound that no animal I knew of could produce, a sound that sent a shiver of terror down my spine. Daniels and I exchanged nervous glances, our rifles at the ready. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I couldn't find my voice, couldn't bring myself to answer. The darkness seemed to close in around us, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, of being hunted. That's when I saw it, or at least I thought I did. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, humanoid in shape but twisted and contorted. It moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs elongated and its steps silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I raised my rifle, aiming it at the approaching figure. "Daniels, do you see that?" I hissed, my voice trembling. He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is that thing?" The figure drew closer, and I could make out its features, or the lack thereof. It had no face, just a featureless, shadowy void where its head should be. It seemed to glide towards us, defying the laws of physics. In that moment, all rational thought fled. We opened fire, our bullets tearing through the creature, but it didn't react. It simply continued its eerie advance, as if the gunfire had no effect. Panic set in, and we turned and ran, our footsteps echoing in the silent desert. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the outpost, where our fellow soldiers were waiting. They had heard the howling too, and their faces were pale with fear. The radio had sprung back to life, and we reported the encounter, though we left out the details of the faceless, shadowy figure. For the rest of the night, we huddled together in the outpost, our rifles trained on the door, listening to the haunting howls that echoed through the desert. It felt like an eternity before dawn finally broke, and the other whirly sounds ceased. We were debriefed by our superiors, and they assured us that our encounter was classified, and that we were not to speak of it to anyone. They never mentioned the word Skinwalker, but I knew what we had encountered that night was something beyond our comprehension. I left the military not long after that, haunted by the memory of that faceless, shadowy figure and the unearthly howls that still echoed in my dreams. I never returned to the Arizona desert, and I never spoke of that night again, until now. I can still hear the howling in the darkest corners of my mind, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be discovered by those who dare to venture into the unknown.
I've seen things in my life that defy explanation, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the barracks, when the world as I knew it crumbled into darkness and terror. I was stationed at a remote military base, deep within the New Mexico desert. The mission was classified, and we were told only what we needed to know. The barracks were a series of low, nondescript buildings surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. It was the middle of the night, and I was lying in my bunk, staring at the dimly lit ceiling. My fellow soldiers were scattered around, some snoring softly, others deep in restless slumber. I couldn't sleep. The unease had been growing ever since we arrived at this forsaken place. Stories had circulated among the soldiers, tales of strange happenings in the desert, of creatures lurking in the shadows. They called them Skinwalkers, shapeshifters from Navajo legend. I had laughed off such superstitions, but that night, my skepticism would crumble. A distant howl pierced the silence, a mournful cry that sent a chill down my spine. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. It sounded like no animal I had ever heard, a sound that seemed to carry with it a sense of dread. I exchanged uneasy glances with my bunkmates, and we listened in silence as the howling continued, growing closer. The barracks were plunged into darkness as the power went out, and emergency red lights flickered to life. Panic rippled through the room as we fumbled for flashlights and radios. The eerie howling continued, echoing through the barracks. "Stay calm, everyone," our sergeant barked, trying to regain control. "We'll get the power back on." But the howling grew louder, and the air seemed to thicken with fear. I shone my flashlight around the room, and that's when I saw them. Shadows, grotesque and twisted, moving along the walls. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized they were coming from the windows. "Contact!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "We've got contact!" The room erupted in chaos as soldiers scrambled to their feet, rifles in hand. The howling grew deafening, and then they appeared. The Skinwalkers. They slithered through the windows, their forms shifting and contorting as they moved. They wore the shapes of wolves, their eyes burning with malevolent intelligence. Panic gave way to sheer terror as we opened fire, our bullets tearing through the Skinwalkers. But they were like shadows, insubstantial and unharmed by our bullets. They leaped and bounded around the room, their presence a nightmare come to life. My flashlight caught one of them in its beam, revealing a faceless, shifting visage that defied all reason. I felt a scream rise in my throat, but it was drowned out by the frenzied gunfire and the nightmarish howling. Bullets passed through the Skinwalkers without effect, and one by one, my comrades fell, their faces contorted in terror as the creatures closed in. I could do nothing but watch in horror as they dragged my friends into the shadows, their agonized screams fading into the night. I managed to retreat to a corner of the room, my rifle trembling in my hands. The Skinwalkers seemed to be toying with me, their eyes fixed on mine, their howling a tormenting cacophony. I felt a surge of desperation as I realized there was no way out, no escape from this living nightmare. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the Skinwalkers vanished, leaving the barracks in stunned silence. The power flickered back on, and the emergency lights dimmed. I was alone, surrounded by the lifeless bodies of my comrades. I stumbled out of the barracks and found the base in chaos. Other barracks had been similarly attacked, and soldiers wandered in a daze, their faces etched with the horror of what they had witnessed. The sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the base, and I knew I had to report what had happened. The debriefing was a blur, and the higher-ups dismissed my account as a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But I knew the truth. I had seen the Skinwalkers, and I had lived to tell the tale. I left the military not long after, haunted by the memories of that night. I couldn't escape the feeling that the Skinwalkers were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. I had glimpsed a darkness beyond comprehension, a darkness that would forever haunt my dreams.
I had just returned from my final deployment in Afghanistan, a veteran seeking solace in the familiar sights of my home state, New Mexico. It had been a long and arduous journey through the horrors of war, and I yearned for the open road and the vast desert landscapes that had always brought me comfort. On a cool autumn evening, I found myself cruising down a desolate stretch of highway, the moon casting an eerie glow over the desert. I had taken a week's leave to clear my mind, and the solitude of the empty highway seemed like the perfect escape. As the miles rolled on, I couldn't help but reflect on the memories of the war, the faces of comrades lost, and the darkness that lingered in my soul. The desert had always been a place of healing for me, a place where I could find peace amidst the vast expanse of sand and sagebrush. But that night, the desert held something else in its depths, something that would test the limits of my courage and sanity. As I drove deeper into the night, a sense of unease settled upon me. It was as if the very air had thickened with an ominous presence. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the twisted forms of juniper trees and distant rock formations. The wind whispered through the desert, carrying with it a faint, mournful howling. I brushed it off as the sound of the wind, but it grew louder, more unsettling, until it became impossible to ignore. I slowed my car and peered out into the desert, trying to locate the source of the haunting sound. The howling seemed to come from all around, surrounding me, closing in. My heart quickened, and I felt a knot of fear in my stomach. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure on the side of the road, just beyond the reach of my headlights. It moved with an unnatural grace, its form shifting and contorting. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its malevolent presence. I pulled over, my instincts urging me to investigate, to confront whatever this thing was. I stepped out of my car, the cool desert air sending shivers down my spine. The howling continued, growing louder, more desperate. I walked toward the shadowy figure, my heart pounding in my chest. It seemed to beckon me to draw me closer, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. I called out, my voice trembling, "Who's there?" The figure turned to face me, and I gasped in horror. It wore the shape of a coyote, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. But it was no ordinary coyote. It was a skinwalker, a creature from Navajo legend, a shapeshifter that could take on the forms of animals or even humans. Panic coursed through my veins as I realized the danger I was in. I stumbled backward, my thoughts racing. I knew I had to get back to my car and escape, but the skinwalker blocked my path, its eyes locked onto mine. With a sudden burst of strength, I turned and sprinted back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. The howling grew louder, more frenzied, and I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, its unnatural grace allowing it to close the distance. I jumped into my car and slammed the door shut, fumbling for the keys. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, leaving the skinwalker behind in the dust. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and for a moment, I saw its twisted form, illuminated by my taillights. As I drove away, the howling faded into the distance, and the desert returned to its eerie silence. I knew I had encountered something beyond explanation, something that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my days. I never spoke of that night to anyone, for fear that they would think me mad. But I knew the truth, and I knew that the desert held secrets that should never be unearthed. It was a place of beauty and mystery, but also a place of darkness and danger, a place where the ancient legends of the Navajo still held sway.